You wake up already weary, as if you've run a marathon in someone else's dream. The sun pours through the window, but instead of light, it brings a strange kind of heaviness, a weight that settles over your chest with no clear name. You sip your coffee in silence, staring out at a world that feels distant, as if you're somehow both in it and apart from it. You go about your day wearing a smile stitched from habit, answering questions, nodding, caring, yet underneath there's a quiet ache, an invisible pull towards something unknown. You feel everything, and yet you're not sure what belongs to you anymore. Some have called it sensitivity, others have dismissed it as being too emotional, but deep down you know it's more than that. It's not just that you feel what others feel, you carry it. You hold space for everyone, sometimes so much that you disappear in the process. This is the silent wound of the empath, and it is far more complex than the world tends to understand. Carl Jung once spoke of the empath not as a sentimental figure, but as a vessel, a psychic bridge through which the unspoken, unseen, and unresolved forces of the collective move. He saw the empath as someone who doesn't merely witness another's sorrow, but who embodies it without knowing where the boundary lies. And that lack of awareness can become a spiritual vulnerability, for the empath, who has not yet awakened to their own depth, becomes a container for what does not belong to them. The result is often exhaustion without cause, mood swings without context, and a slow disconnection from the core of their own soul. Have you ever left a room feeling heavier than when you entered it? Sat with someone, only to walk away feeling sadness you couldn't explain? Do emotions sometimes rise in you like tides from an unseen ocean, strong, vivid, but without a clear source? Maybe they were never yours to begin with. Maybe, without realizing it, you've been living as a mirror for pain that isn't your own. And this is where the danger lies, because when you don't know the origin of your emotions, you begin to lose the thread of who you are. You become porous, and in that porousness, the world begins to enter you, not just through love, but through grief, fear, and unmet shadows. This is not a poetic exaggeration, it is a psychological truth. Empathy is not simply a virtue, it is a capacity, one that must be guided, understood, and most importantly, protected. When unconscious, it opens you to the archetypal forces that Jung warned us about, forces that are not inherently evil, but that can take root in the psyche of the unaware, and the empath, often praised for their heart, becomes haunted by their unguarded openness. But if what you're feeling isn't yours, then where is it coming from? And more importantly, are you feeling it, or is it quietly taking over? It begins quietly, subtly, a kind of emotional merging that doesn't announce itself, but slips in like fog over still water. At first you think it's love. You feel drawn to someone whose soul seems fractured, whose sadness is tucked behind forced laughter, whose life flickers like a candle struggling against the wind. You feel pulled not just to comfort them, but to carry their sorrow, to repair what life has splintered in them, and something in you whispers that this is compassion, that this is what it means to care. But behind that whisper is something more complicated, an unspoken contract being made in the silence, one that says, I will bleed for your healing if it means I don't have to face my own emptiness. Carl Jung warned us that empathy, without awareness, becomes psychic permeability. It is not always a bridge of grace. Sometimes it is an open gate through which the unresolved energies of others rush in, wearing the mask of intimacy. The empath, in their unguarded state, does not recognize this invasion for what it is. They interpret the ache as a connection. They see emotional chaos and instinctively reach out, not realizing that the shadow has entered through the guise of love. And the deeper the wound of the other, the stronger the pull becomes. Why? Because pain makes them feel needed, and feeling needed masks the terror of feeling invisible. Imagine a woman who meets a partner in crisis, a man whose childhood left bruises on his spirit, whose rage simmers beneath charm, whose sadness is like a room with no doors. She tells herself she sees his potential, She believes her love will be the light that finally reaches him, so she stays. She listens. She absorbs. Slowly, her world began to shift. She stops laughing like she used to. Her sleep grows restless. She finds herself apologizing for things that aren't hers, and still she stays, convinced that her presence is healing him, when in truth she has simply become the vessel into which his pain now pours. It is not love she's living. It is emotional possession disguised as purpose. And the more she tries to save him, the more she disappears. This is the danger that hides within unchecked empathy. It becomes a performance of healing that masks a fear of looking inward. Because to turn inward would mean confronting the parts of ourselves that believe we are only lovable when we are saving someone else. It would mean facing the silence we've spent years avoiding, and so instead we take on others' grief, call it love, and let it define us. But empathy, Jung reminds us, is not inherently virtuous unless it is conscious. Without boundaries, it becomes a siphon. Without awareness, it becomes a trance. In that trance, we fall for people not because of who they are, but because their wounds mirror a wound in us we never healed. We confuse the ache of familiarity with the presence of love. We think we are choosing them, when really we are reenacting a story the soul has told 1,000 times before. A story where pain equals purpose and helping equals worth. The truth is, some of the most powerful emotional entanglements aren't rooted in love at all. They are rooted in unspoken grief, seeking somewhere to land. And the empath, if unaware, becomes that landing place. They feel the chaos of another and mistake it for intimacy. They feel the pull of suffering and call it connection. However, emotional resonance does not always equal alignment, and compassion, when misused, becomes a kind of spiritual overreach. Herein lies the shift. To awaken as an empath is to begin discerning between true connection and psychic entanglement. It is to recognize when you are being drawn into someone's shadow, not to illuminate it, but to hold it in place. Because not all brokenness wants healing. Some pain feeds on attention. Some suffering is sustained by the presence of someone who will never say no. And unless the empath learns to say no, they will forever be saying yes to their own erasure. This is not to shame empathy. It is to sanctify it. It is to take it from the realm of passive suffering into the sacred fire of conscious choice. When the empath sees clearly, they no longer fall in love with wounds. They no longer offer themselves as the balm for someone else's abandonment. Instead, they pause, they breathe, and they ask, "Is this mine to carry?" And yet, not all the feelings we absorb come from people standing before us. Some emotions rise from nowhere, like ancient winds from an unseen place. Some griefs arrive with no name, no story, only weight. This, too, holds a mystery. Because what if the heaviness inside you isn't just from those you've met, but from the ones who came before you? Sometimes the sorrow within you arrives uninvited. It does not speak in words, nor come with a memory you can trace. It rises instead like fog from the forest floor, thick, ancient, without a face. You feel it in the mornings, when your chest tightens for no reason, in the stillness of night when tears surface from somewhere beyond your life. You try to name it, to rationalize it, but nothing in your personal history quite explains its shape. This is the quiet haunting of the empath who unknowingly carries the sorrow of those who came before them. It is not just emotional sensitivity, it is ancestral resonance. And it often begins as a confusion. Why do I feel this deeply when nothing has happened? But beneath that question lies a deeper truth. You are not just feeling for others, you are feeling for generations. Carl Jung once spoke of the collective unconscious, a vast psychic reservoir that holds the memories, emotions, and archetypes of our species. But within our individual lineage exists a personal collective, our ancestors' unwept tears, unspoken fears, and unlived truths. These don't vanish when ignored. They ripple forward, seeking a vessel brave enough to feel what was never allowed. And often, that vessel is the empath, the one whose heart is already open, whose walls are already thin. The result is an inner life crowded with emotions that don't quite belong, yet feel impossibly real. Imagine a woman who begins to weep in therapy, not over a present loss, but from a grief she cannot name. As the sessions unfold, it becomes clear that her sorrow is not hers alone. Her mother was a stoic woman, never permitted to cry. Her grandmother endured betrayal in silence. Her great-grandmother was exiled from her homeland and never spoke of it again. And now, 3 generations later, the tears finally come through her. She becomes the first voice for the pain that has echoed through her lineage, but was never allowed to be heard. She is not breaking down, she is breaking through. This is the invisible contract many empaths inherit, to be the emotional translator for a family's forgotten history, to carry the sadness no one else had the strength or permission to carry. And yet, without awareness, this inheritance becomes a burden. You begin to see the world not only through your eyes, but through the lens of your ancestors' unhealed wounds. A man whose father was never nurtured may find himself craving connection in ways that confuse him. A woman whose lineage includes generations of silenced women may feel a throat-tightening fear whenever she tries to speak her truth. These are not random traits. They are echoes, and you may be the first in your line with the sensitivity required to listen. But here lies the paradox. The empath, while gifted with extraordinary perception, often lacks the tools to separate what is theirs from what is inherited. And so, they try to fix the world outside as a way of quieting the storm within. They become the helper, the healer, the emotional guardian, but beneath their service lies a silent question. If I help others release their pain, will mine finally make sense? This unconscious strategy leads them away from their center. They begin to mistake their ancestral grief for their identity, and in doing so, they lose the clarity of their own soul's voice. To awaken to this truth is both painful and liberating. Painful because it requires acknowledging that much of what you felt may not be yours, that some of your most intimate emotions are borrowed. But liberating because it offers you a new kind of power, the power to choose what you continue to carry. Empathy can be sacred, but when it's used to house generations of silence, it must be alchemized. You are not a storage place for pain. You are the threshold through which that pain can be transmuted into meaning, into understanding, into rest. Still, the challenge remains. When you carry what no one else could, it's easy to forget yourself. You begin reacting not from the present, but from inherited echoes. You feel a need to nurture everyone. You try to fix what isn't broken. You step into roles no one asked you to play, not because you're weak, but because your soul is wired to respond to invisible cries. And yet, this reflex to heal can be a mask, one that hides your own fear of facing what lives inside you. The grief that was passed down becomes a mirror, and instead of looking into it, you look away, hoping to repair others as a form of self-redemption. And when that buried pain starts to take root inside you, you begin to react. Not by facing it, but by trying to save others, as if healing them will somehow heal the part of you that was never allowed to speak. At first, it feels noble. You're the one people turn to when their world begins to crack. You're the shoulder, the ear, the soft voice in the chaos, and somewhere deep inside, you feel useful, you feel seen. But over time, something inside begins to ache. Not from giving, but from never being received. Beneath the surface of your compassion lies a quiet fear that if you are not helping, you are nothing. That if you stop holding others together, you might come undone. And so you keep pouring, keep listening, keep healing. Not because you have nothing left, but because you are afraid of what you might find if you ever stopped. Carl Jung once said that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. But the empath, in their unconscious state, often chooses the opposite path. They shine outward and flee inward. They decorate the world with kindness, so they don't have to sit in the silence of their own unspoken needs. And slowly, their generosity becomes a mask. A beautiful one, yes, but still a mask. One that hides the parts of themselves that are longing not to be useful, but to be whole. There's a man in his 40s who spends his days mentoring troubled youth. He's warm, patient, and always present. To everyone around him, he's a hero, a man who gives without asking for anything in return. But when he gets home at night, the house feels hollow. He doesn't know how to sit still. When no one needs him, he begins to unravel. He picks fights with his partner, overextends his work, scrolls his phone late into the night just to avoid the quiet. His identity is built on being strong for others, but in the absence of that role, he feels invisible, empty. And though he would never admit it, part of him fears that if he stopped being needed, he might stop existing altogether. This is the trap many empaths fall into. They become the healer not just from love, but from survival. Somewhere in their early story, they learned that love had to be earned, that visibility required usefulness, that presence depended on performance. And so they built a life around being indispensable. But what begins as a gift becomes a cage, a performance repeated so often that they forget it's a role, and the irony is heartbreaking. The more they give to others, the more they abandon themselves. They become fluent in everyone else's pain, yet illiterate in their own. Psychologically, this is not a weakness, it is a pattern. A self-preservation instinct born in childhood, where attention was conditional and self-worth was entangled with service. It is a survival strategy cloaked in virtue. But survival is not the same as aliveness. And the empath who lives only in response to others eventually forgets what they look like when no one is watching. The spiritual danger is this: when empathy becomes performance, healing turns into self-erasure. The empath stops asking, "What do I feel?" and instead asks, "What do they need from me?" And with each act of quiet self-sacrifice, their inner world fades into the background. They mistake their ability to hold space for their ability to be seen. But to be a mirror for others does not mean you must vanish in the reflection. And so, the real question is not whether you are helping others, but why. Are you offering yourself from fullness or from fear? Are you healing because you love or because you fear being unlovable if you don't? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations to turn inward. To be honest, we must acknowledge that sometimes we choose selflessness not because we are saints, but because we are scared. The turning point arrives when you realize that goodness, if used to avoid your own depth, becomes a mask of avoidance. And no mask, no matter how noble, can bring peace. You begin to sense that something is missing, not from the world, but from within you, a part of yourself that longs not just to give, but to be. Not just to be strong, but to be known. But the more you give, the more you vanish, until the role of the healer becomes the prison. You're no longer living, you're serving a version of yourself that no longer belongs to your soul. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the role you once wore with pride begins to feel like a weight you can no longer carry. You find yourself weary not from a single act of compassion, but from the habit of compassion itself. The constant caretaking, the endless emotional labor, the silent vow to be the one who holds it all together, it begins to take its toll. You start waking up tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the unrelenting demand of being the strong one. You're not sure when it began. You only know that somewhere along the way, your tenderness became a task, and your empathy a prison. Carl Jung named this the wounded healer complex, a psychic pattern in which the desire to help others is fueled by unhealed pain within the self. The healer, unaware of their own wound, seeks purpose through service, identity through sacrifice. And though the world may applaud their devotion, they are often suffering in silence, chained to the very image they created. What began as love becomes labor. What once felt like grace begins to feel like self-erasure. Picture a woman in her 50s. She's the one who remembers everyone's birthdays, who brings soup when a neighbor falls ill, who answers every late-night call from a distressed family member. She smiles through it all. But in her private moments, she feels invisible. No one asks how she is. No one notices when her voice trembles. Her needs go unnamed. Her fatigue goes unacknowledged. And deep down, she carries a belief she cannot quite voice, that love must be earned through endurance. That to be loved, she must be useful. That to matter, she must disappear into the needs of others. This is not compassion. This is captivity. And yet, it's a form of captivity that feels noble, because culture has long praised the silent sacrificer, the one who burns quietly to keep others warm. But true love is not measured by how much you suffer, and true worth is not found in how much you endure. If you must bleed to be seen, then you are not being loved. You are being used. The emotional challenge here is subtle but profound. When your identity is fused with the role of caretaker, stepping back feels like abandonment. You fear that if you stop absorbing others' pain, you'll lose the only version of yourself that has ever been accepted. But what you're really losing is the illusion that you must earn your place through emotional labor. You're not abandoning others, you are remembering yourself. Jung understood that the archetype of the healer, when left unconscious, can devour the self. It creates a loop where suffering becomes a badge of honor, and depletion becomes a strange proof of devotion. But healing is not meant to cost you your essence. Compassion without boundaries is not love. It is self-abandonment in the name of virtue. And in the long run, no one is truly healed by someone who is vanishing in the process. The turning point begins when you ask the question most empaths fear. Who am I if I stop playing this role? At first, the silence that follows is deafening. You might feel guilty. You might feel emptiness. But if you stay with that silence, if you allow yourself to grieve the identity built on overgiving, you will begin to hear something deeper, a voice that has long been buried beneath obligation, a part of you that does not want to be needed. It wants to be known. You begin to see that the temple you built through sacrifice, though sacred, has become a place of confinement. And no matter how many people it shelters, it cannot shelter you, because it was never built to hold you, only the image of who you thought you had to be. But your soul is not here to be an image. It is here to burn, to speak, to breathe, to belong to itself again. Eventually, life will ask you to choose. Keep dissolving in everyone else's pain, or finally hold the flame of your own soul. And in that moment, you'll understand. Helping doesn't mean absorbing, and love doesn't require self-erasure. There is a moment in every awakening when the empath, once consumed by the need to prove love through suffering, pauses and breathes. And in that breath, something shifts. The silence that once felt unbearable now begins to feel sacred. The guilt that used to creep in when setting boundaries starts to dissolve. Slowly they realize, it is not selfish to protect your energy, it is wise. It is not cruel to say no, it is clarifying. And it is not love to vanish in someone else's story. True love, real love, does not ask you to disappear. This is the threshold the awakened empath begins to cross, the place where compassion stops being a performance of absorption and becomes an act of anchored presence. No longer frantic to rescue, they learn to witness. No longer driven by guilt, they begin to choose from stillness. It is not that they feel less, but that they now know what they are feeling. They no longer confuse other people's pain with their own. And in that clarity, empathy is transformed from a porous floodgate into a luminous channel, strong, conscious, and rooted. Picture a man who for most of his life was the one everyone leaned on. He grew up in a house where emotions were storms that needed calming, where being the good one meant never having needs of his own. As an adult, he prided himself on being endlessly available. He thought love meant always saying yes. Until one day, his body said no. His spirit said no. He sat at a family dinner and felt an overwhelming fatigue, not physical, but emotional. He smiled through stories that drained him. He gave advice to people who never listened. He carried everyone in that room, but not himself. That night, something cracked open, not with drama, but with truth. He went home, turned off his phone and sat in the quiet. And in that quiet, he finally asked himself a question he had avoided for decades. What would it feel like to love without losing myself? That was the beginning. He didn't stop caring. He didn't become cold. But he stopped saying yes when his body said no. He stopped calling it love when it hurt to give. He stopped showing up where his presence was expected, but not respected. And to his surprise, something beautiful happened. The light didn't go out, it got brighter. Because now, it wasn't scattered across 100 unmet expectations. It was whole, focused, sacred. This is the hidden truth most empaths are never told. Love is not measured by how much of yourself you abandon. You do not need to carry someone's sorrow to honor it. You do not need to shrink so someone else can shine. Boundaries are not walls that push people away. They are the gates that protect your inner temple. When you draw them with awareness, you're not disconnecting. You're choosing to connect from truth, not trauma. Carl Jung taught that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off parts of the self, but by embracing them all. For the empath, this includes the part that knows when to say enough. The part that recognizes when love has become performance. The part that longs not to be everything for everyone, but to be something for themselves. And in honoring that, empathy is no longer the open wound it once was. It becomes an act of deep spiritual maturity. Kindness becomes wisdom when it knows how to protect itself. Empathy becomes powerful when it stops being porous and starts being anchored. You begin to discern, not every emotion is yours to hold. Not every crisis is yours to solve. Not every soul is yours to carry. You can witness another's struggle without becoming it. You can offer warmth without burning out. And you can love, truly love, without dissolving into someone else's need. And when you no longer need to disappear in order to love, you stop being the sponge. You become the mirror, not of wounds, but of forgotten light. There comes a point in the empath's journey when the compulsion to heal begins to fall away, not from bitterness, but from clarity. It's a quiet unfolding, like mist lifting from a mirror. You begin to see that your value was never meant to come from how much you could carry, how much you could fix, or how much you could endure for others. Somewhere deep in the architecture of your soul, you understand now. You were never meant to be a sponge for the world's pain. You were meant to be a mirror of its potential. And that changes everything. This is the turning point that the wounded healer rarely expects. Because for so long, your identity was tied to effort. You thought your presence had to be earned through sacrifice. You believed your goodness was proved through overextension. But when the storm inside begins to calm, you notice a different kind of strength rising. One that doesn't need to rescue or absorb in order to be powerful. You no longer feel drawn to chaos like a moth to fire. You no longer mistake someone's need for your purpose. Instead, your presence becomes something else entirely. Not the fixer, not the savior, just light. Imagine a woman who once lost herself in every relationship. She was the one who listened too long, gave too much, and always held the emotional weight when no one else could. But in time, she stopped confusing empathy with obligation. She learnt to sit in her own silence without shame. She stopped answering calls that drained her. She walked away from conversations where she had to shrink, and something miraculous happened, not in grand gestures, but in the small things. She began to smile again, not out of politeness, but from something real. Her laughter returned, not as a performance, but as a song. People still came to her, but now they came for something different, not to lean, not to take, but to witness. Because she had become the kind of presence that didn't echo back pain, but reminded others of their own light. This is the transformation that occurs when the empath reclaims their soul. They stop walking into rooms scanning for wounds to heal. They stop absorbing what doesn't belong to them, and yet, paradoxically, they become more healing than ever, because they no longer offer themselves as a container. They become a reflection, a mirror that doesn't distort but clarifies. A presence that doesn't pull others into dependency but quietly says, "Look, this is what wholeness feels like." Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And this is what the awakened empath begins to understand. You don't need to suffer to be valuable. You don't need to be everything for everyone to be enough. You are not here to disappear inside other people's darkness. You are here to radiate from the center of your own light. And in doing so, you become a living invitation, not to be rescued, but to return to self. It is in this stage of the journey that the martyr dissolves. The fixer bows out. The identity built on exhaustion gives way to something far more luminous. You begin to live from overflow, not depletion. You speak only when your voice is aligned. You give only when it comes from integrity, and you love not as an escape from yourself, but as an offering of your wholeness. In this way, your healing becomes non-verbal. It becomes a frequency, a quiet, grounded reminder to others that it is possible to feel deeply without being consumed. And so, the empath finally rests, not because the world has grown lighter, but because they are no longer trying to carry what was never theirs. They understand now that their task was never to be the emotional savior, but the spiritual mirror. To hold up the truth, not through sacrifice, but through stillness. Not through fixing, but through embodiment. Their presence becomes an anchor in a drifting world. And in this stillness, others begin to remember themselves, not because the empath told them who they are, but because they stood quietly in their own truth and let that truth speak louder than words ever could. Because you don't have to suffer to be valuable, you don't have to be everything for everyone. You, just being you, is the healing. There is a kind of peace that rises when you no longer feel the need to be everything for everyone. It does not come with fanfare or applause. It comes quietly, like morning light slipping through the curtains, touching what was once hidden. This is the moment the empath stops running toward pain and begins walking toward presence. The heaviness that once clung to every interaction no longer has a place to land because the container has been closed with care. In its place stands something more rooted, more sacred. Not armor, but alignment. Not walls, but clarity. You begin to realize that your gift was never your ability to absorb the world, but your capacity to remain whole within it. To awaken as an empath is not to shut the heart, but to seat it firmly inside the soul. It is to feel fully, yet remain sovereign. To witness deeply, yet not disappear. You no longer confuse stillness with coldness or boundaries with rejection. You begin to trust that true love does not require you to vanish in order to be worthy, that your essence, as it is, without distortion, is already enough. And from that knowing, a new kind of light begins to rise. Not the frantic glow of overgiving, but the steady flame of someone who has come home to themselves. You are not here to be the sponge. You are not a symbol of sacrifice. You are something far more rare. A living threshold, a soul through which energy becomes meaning. Your sensitivity, when rooted in awareness, is not a weakness but a wisdom. You are where sorrow is seen but not swallowed, where stories are heard but not hijacked. You are not here to carry what others refuse to hold. You are here to remind them, by your very being, that they can hold it themselves. And so, if you feel the stir of this recognition in your chest, let that be your invitation, not too hard, not to retreat, but to rise with rootedness, to feel with discernment, and to reflect that healing does not come from absorption, but from embodiment. The world will always need light, but only if it belongs to you first. Let yours be the kind that doesn't flicker with every wind, but burns steady, like a lantern at the center of your being, a light not offered in pieces, but as presence, whole, anchored, undeniably yours. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here, in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this: when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation, that is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.